Greetings, future fossils. That's you. You'll be a fossil one day. Welcome on board to the show that explores our place in time. Because if tomorrow is anything like yesterday, then we can be sure there are entire buildings full of passionate scholars poring over all of the podcasts left by this moment in history, trying to make sense of what it was like to be alive right now. And I think it's probably for us to be on our best behaviors and make it look like we really gave a college effort at being good ancestors and didn't just fap off through the apocalypse, right? Well, luckily, we've got a fabulous guest this week playing for Team Here and Now. This is my buddy, Meow-Ludo Disco Gamma Meow Meow. No, seriously. I met Meow at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia Innovation Lab back in February while I was giving a talk called Tech Ethics as Psychedelic Parenting. Amazingly, I was not kicked out of the bank, but was in fact able to facilitate a conversation that kept people in the bank building after 5 p.m. on a Friday. And one of those people who came across the street and drank pints with us until midnight was Meow, who is a most impressive friend. He was recently on Australian national news for implanting his Opal Transit card chip in his hand so he can just swipe his hand like Obi-Wan Kenobi to get onto the subway. Very cool. They thought not. They canceled his card under the terms of service, claiming he had damaged or modified his card. But joke was on them because he actually implanted a cash-loaded and anonymous card in his hand. So we have a lot to learn from Meow about how to live in the future, and I'm excited to introduce him to all of you. He's a fascinating dude. He founded the Biofoundry in Australia, which is a biohacking enterprise, and it was the platform upon which he recently ran for political office as a representative of the Science Party and got pretty close. So he also recently taught a seminar on how to invest in cryptocurrency. So our conversation today is the first on Future Fossils where we discuss the potential social and cultural implications of that financial singularity. And I look forward to that. But before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank 3 waves of people. Every single person listening to this podcast, you're amazing. I'm super glad that you're doing it. Thank you. Wave 2, everyone who has subscribed to and or rated and reviewed this show on iTunes. Your ratings boosted this week. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you're helping me get this show into the ears of more people who will enjoy it, which is super important. It's why I'm doing this. It's an act of service, of love, of dedication to what Charles Eisenstein calls the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. So thank you doubly. And triple thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, because about once a week, I go through this micro window of despair where I think I really, really ought to get a telemarketing job or work in an insurance company or, just sell my soul for a little bit so that I can keep devoting myself to this work without freaking out about my finances. I learned recently from an article on reset.me that depression is most likely not a chemical issue, but rather the consequence of brain damage caused by chronic stress. So I'm up in my meditation schedule, folks. I'm going to make sure that I'm lucid, calm, and at the wheel for you. But if you want to make a small investment in the futures market and place your bet on the future version of me that's able to continue doing this full time, then please drop on over to patreon.com/Michael Garfield, where I just started serializing a spoken word science fiction story about the moment that artificial intelligence learns to forge everything beyond our ability to determine its veracity. I also just published 3 musical live recordings, 2 singer-songwriter storyteller sets from Australia tour, as well as a studio duet with my friend Ashley Stone on synthesizer. So if you're into the heady tunes, you can go cop a ton of those at patreon.com/Michael Garfield for free. Okay, friends, I love you. This is a 2-part episode, so I'm going to leave this week on a cliffhanger for you in the middle of an argument, actually. So while you're waiting this week for the rest of this conversation, go back and listen to episode 34 with Tara Jakic, the scientist whose work on the origins of life we mentioned in this episode. And also check out episode 22 with Simon Ugler, who I interviewed while I was on Australia tour. And in the show notes, I'll post a link to the talk I gave at Commonwealth Bank so you can appreciate the climate of absurd, high technological shenanigans in which this friendship grew. All right, folks, here we go. Meow, meow, meow for your delight.
Hey dude, how you going?
You're going well.
Give me 1 second. I'm just going to close my browser. I've just been playing with cryptocurrencies for like the past 3 hours.
Oh, really?
Yeah, man. I bought into Ethereum at like $300 and now it's like gone mental. So I'm like diversifying my portfolio a bit.
Yeah, totally.
Fuck, man. I went through and checked the dates that I would have bought in. I don't know why I did this to myself. I went and checked the dates I would have bought in to Bitcoin.
Uh-huh.
But my account fucked up. $1.40, man.
Oh my God. Yeah, dude,
But
I was like watching it from day one and do not know why I waited. And then I got into it in 2014 and then sold all my shit last year.
Oh, fuck, man.
Was like, this is lame. I was like, I need the money. And I didn't need all of it. I didn't need to sell like the 7 that I had.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, it's, I've waited 3 years and it's not going anywhere. And then that decision in November, I lost something like almost $20,000.
Fuck, man. I told my friend to get in at like $15 for Ethereum. She invested $460. She's got 20 grand now.
Whoa.
She was like online. She's like, I got $500. What should I invest it in? And I'm like, buy Ethereum. And no one else gave her anything worthwhile. So she goes, fuck it, I'll do it. She was like, she's been messaging me. She bought a camper van, has been traveling around Australia. And she's just like laughing. And I'm like, fuck, I didn't buy in. You owe me fucking dinner.
Dinner, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I was going to invest $400 in Bitcoin at $1.40. But like literally, I see my emails. It's like, your account didn't go through. Fuck, our Mt. Gox just got robbed, which is who I was going to buy it through. So I would have lost everything anyway, which would have been even like more bitter if it had been stolen from me rather than incompetency.
Right. Well, I have the one Bitcoin that, because I was depositing cash into a Bitcoin ATM.
Yeah.
And so I have one that for some reason I dicked it up and it ended up on a different wallet address that the only place I had the private key was on the receipt, and I didn't realize it was, so like I threw away the private key. So I have 1.14 Bitcoin that I can't get to.
Oh, baby.
And it's just sitting there. And in like 2 years, that shit could be like, $20,000 or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to be sitting there looking at it, like hoping that I don't care. That I've managed to capitalize on all of these other ICOs, and
you've made everyone else's Bitcoin worth just a little bit more. So you can take that beauty away with you. Also, man, I'm thinking like, I might have told you before, Nicola and I are thinking about getting married by encoding our vows as a smart contract, or more importantly, like a decentralized autonomous organization.
Go on. See, this is great because I really wanted to talk with you about biohacking today, but I'm also reading Common as Air by Lewis Hyde, which is all about the history of IP. And I know you and I have strong thoughts about intellectual property in the commons. And
Yeah.
also, I think the issue of a blockchain wedding contract is like very timely right now. So yeah, so I want to hear
Yeah.
about that.
Well, I think the thing is, like marriage as we know it now, man, is like it's about property, right? It's about assets. We're not going to pretend like it's anything else because in Australia, at least, we have like civil unions, which basically give you the same things as a marriage, but it's not marriage, right? But I think that the problem is that why do we want marriage equality when we have legal institutions that give you the same things as a marriage? It's because the name is not marriage, right? So people are like, I want what they have. The grasses, I want what the Joneses have, This bullshit. But the thing is that I'm like, well, if that's what it's coming down to now, why not just fucking scrap the whole thing and reinvent it? And we thought about this because Nicola and I are in a poly relationship. So in a poly relationship, obviously assets can't be divided according to a civil union. So in that case, well, fuck, you have to reinvent the whole thing. So I'm like, well, fucking crypto is a good way of going about it. We have these things like DAOs, which allow us to like fucking put things in. Because one of the big things that they were talking about for a long time was superannuation. So even if you're in a de facto relationship with a member of the same sex before this marriage, the civil unions and stuff came about, there were some kind of legal mechanisms to be able to divvy up super on death and stuff like that. But like when you're in a poly relationship, you have to fucking do ad hoc, also pro rata fucking super measurements as time goes on. So like, what about if someone, like, say for example, I'm in a relationship with Nicola for our entire lives, but someone joins for like 2 years and they fulfill functions in our relationship, which are like, they do some domestic duties, they fucking help us out around the house, but because of that, they suffer work-related expenses. How do we fucking divvy up the super to make sure, well, I don't have any super, but like if I did, how would we divvy it up so that everyone is treated fairly in the relationship?
It's funny though, because like marriage was not originally devised for treating people fairly. And in its current implementations, it's definitely not. I mean, I saw my parents split up, and I don't think that was fair to either party. My dad definitely did what he could to make sure my mom was like taken care of after they split up. But I mean, it's insane now. And like, I've seen people in our generation who split up, and I guess this is a little off topic, but there are definitely sort of like de facto, like the way that the court handles this and just says, okay, you're the man and you're the woman, so we're gonna give you this and you that, and it's just like, I think that's again another instance that blockchain applications are wise to try and replace. So at least you've got like, okay, look, this is very clear. It's putting, and this can tie kind of into a number of different angles that you and I have discussed, that the thing about decentralizing everything and putting the responsibility back on individuals to consent and like that agreement, like how insanely tricky it is to even have a poly relationship. Like I can't even claim that like my relationship, we've definitely been talking about it for a decade, but it's like when you get together in college, opening that kind of stuff up is like changing the charter of your company or something. It's like, it's like kicking out the CEO and replacing them with like a chimpanzee in a suit or something. Like I
think about it like this. You kick out the CEO and you replace it with a board of directors. But even that decision is a big one, right? Because who's on the board? What power do they have? And the thing is, like, with Nick and my poly relationship, like, man, it's been a rocky road getting to where we are. But now we're, like, fucking so secure. But also, like, when we bring on people, it's almost like a business relationship. You've learned from past mistakes. You know who you want on, how much power you want them to have, and how that gets vested over time. And the thing is that, like, I read an article that was about being like unabashedly poly from the get-go. So one of the things that it said in this was like, if you're poly, don't go into a new relationship pretending like that relationship is going to be like, I'm going to cut off all partners for a certain period of time and just enjoy this new relationship for a bit. Because what ends up happening is you say, like you said, you set up this thing, you set the ground rules differently. And when you set the ground rules differently, this means that changing from those ground rules is a really big step. So they're like, when you meet, if you're in a poly relationship that's established, you tell them, when they say to you, how many other partners do you have? You say a number, even if you don't, because it just sets this expectation that that's the way that it will be in the future. And you say to them, well, they're private, or I'm going to let you in on some of them. But like I was in a relationship where it basically went trigonomous. So I was with Nick, I was with this other girl. This other girl wasn't seeing anyone else. I wasn't seeing anyone else outside those two. And then Nick could see whoever she wanted. But it was a bad foundation because it ended up, this girl wanted to get more and more mono over time. And then basically when I tried to open things up with her, it wasn't okay. And then that started inhibiting my relationship with Nick to the point that I couldn't see other people. Are we recording this, by the way? Is this interview styles?
We don't have to include anything in this that you...
Oh, no, dude. I just want to know, because like when I know I'm being recorded, I present differently.
Yeah, well, sure, whatever works for you.
Because I like make sure to introduce the salient details and don't have any assumed prior knowledge and all that shit.
Right. Well, I think our only assumed prior knowledge of each other at this point is that we both hate the guy who patented Vanta Black.
Yeah, man. So did you see Vanta Pink? I think it was.
No. Okay, let's get there.
Yeah,
Hold on. Let's wait. I want to hear what you had to say about this. This is because I'm in this situation where like I don't actually. I'm pretty sure my parents aren't listening to this show, so it's okay. but like, you know, let's just say that I'm in an unprecedented and complicated situation in love right now. So I'm listening to everything that you're saying with bated breath.
Yeah. Okay. We're going Vanta Pink. Is this what the road we're going down?
We can get to Vanta Pink, but so you're just saying establish things openly. Be
okay. Yeah, so
you know.
To jam out a bit more. So like with the polyamorous thing, I think it's Nick and I were in a bit of a unique situation. So she was kinky and I was poly before we met. And then I became kinky and she became poly after we started seeing each other. Now, we were always sleeping with other people throughout our entire relationship. So I was in a poly relationship when I met Nick. That broke down. I stopped seeing both of them, and then Nick and I started seeing each other not long afterwards. But there was a gap. Like, I let that relationship die, and Nick went off and did her own thing, and then we like independently came back and said, you know what, we actually fucking had something. Let's kind of see how this goes on a like having us as primary kind of things. Now, Nick and I are primary, and this is like a dirty word in the poly community because your relationships are supposed to be what they are. There's not supposed to be hierarchies because this denotes kind of like the idea is that if someone's a primary, they're worth more.
Yes. Yeah. So I've been reading More Than Two by Vo and Reichert, or I think that's how you say. And you know, they're definitely sort of they stand in critique of this. Yeah. That it's like, which I think is, you know, it's like they're taking an ecological view of relationships, which I like. You know, they say like kind of the whole idea is that you're free to allow whatever seeds blow into the garden to sprout there, but they are explicit about how
there's a lot of seed blowing everywhere, by the way.
Yes, I noticed that. Yeah, I mean, it is a very you know, for whatever reason, plant sex doesn't gross people out as much, so it's good. But they still sort of maintain that there's a certain amount of horticulture involved, and I think that, I mean, ultimately they do make room for, I think there's, you know, certain relationships are gonna have priority if you give them priority, you know.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that my friend Murray said this to me. Even so the competing view to a hierarchical view of poly. So there's primary, and then the opposing kind of the other view is this relationship anarchy, which is that every relationship is what it is, and there's that they're not dependent on other relationships. So with a primary relationship, there's primaries or anchor relationships is a nicer term, because everyone's trying to get rid of these hierarchical terms for them. There's like anchor relationships, and then there's like satellites or things like this, and they invent other terms which
like
says,
a sale relationship.
Yeah,
it's like shit.
So
who wants to be the anchor if someone else is the sales? But at any rate.
So there's like all these terms, but if you think about it from a horticultural perspective, like even there, man, there's plants that are dominant, and there's plants which are weeds, and there's plants that are shrubs, and like all these things, right? But the relationship anarchy is more like a mycological thing, right? So mushrooms have like indeterminate amounts of sexes. They just have compatible mating types, and they get into these huge networks. There's a very good way to describe this relationship anarchy. So myco stuff, fungal stuff is much more like the relationship anarchy. If we're talking horticultural, man, in the garden, there's always the corn and there's always the grass, right? There's natural hierarchies that establish themselves. And I think that in my relationship, this is a much more natural way of doing it, right? I don't want to do my fucking taxes and have my like casual sex buddy doing my laundry. So there's a natural hierarchy that establishes itself. And like, even if someone was a really important partner to me, it would take a long time before I start bringing them into my finances and my boring duties, because I want to have a different type of relationship with them. And this is why I'm a fan of relationship hierarchy. And people can fucking say all they want. You know what?
Because of taxes?
Yeah, fuck, man. You know what? I have one of the most successful poly relationships I know of, and that's because we have a hierarchy. And like, you know what? It doesn't mean you mean less than me. It's like you have a lot of fucking catch up to do before I invite you to do all the boring shit you probably don't want to do in the first place.
Yeah, I guess if you look at it as what a certain person is privileged to suffer of you, definitely. It's like that actually, it's not just privileges, folks. It's the shit work.
Yeah, exactly right. And the thing is that, like, what you give is equal to what you gain. And like this whole thing kind of comes down to the whole basis of how we form relationships and friendships in the first place. Like if we remove the poly label and just say, how do we form friendships? This is by sharing secrets and privileged information is a better way of saying it, at the right times with the right people that's reciprocated. That's the foundation of all friendship, right? All poly does is add sex into it. And like you have a best friend. You might have 5 best friends. If you fuck them, it's completely irrelevant if you're poly, right? It just changes the way that goes. And then if you have a partner, a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a life partner, that's just a different type of the same relationship. So that's why I'm like, of course hierarchies exist. They exist in every one of our relationships. Formalizing it doesn't detract away from it, and it doesn't make anyone of less value.
Totally. Well, I think it is something I see, to introduce the sort of integral developmental stuff into it, because I find that useful to a point that we're kind of looking at a strata of perspectives in the cultural ecosystem here. And we've got the entrepreneurial, rational, modern actor. And then you get into this sort of postmodern network thinking. The mycelial relationship anarchy thing is like loosely equivalent to a Napster, like just like totally like balls out peer-to-peer file sharing. And then there's the acknowledgement that even in a mature forest ecosystem, you have the mycelia there, kind of shuttling nutrients around, but then you've also got, an established canopy of old growth trees, and then like, ground cover and all this other stuff. Definitely. And that these natural hierarchies emerge, that there's an apex predator, that's like, there's very few of them because you only need a few in the ecosystem. And, certain species are quote unquote keystone species, and all this stuff is real. Yeah. And the fact that there are fewer orcas than there are salmon is not some sort of patriarchal, phallocentric imposition of our control urge onto the natural order. Like as soon as you're like, oh, the natural order is actually rather, the I Heart Huckabee is like, what happens in a meadow at dusk is actually the natural order. It's the Richard Brautigan's Machines of Loving Grace. So in that space, it seems like, my stance on should music be free has grown up along. Like I was reading, to like kind of dovetail this into intellectual property, because I have been thinking specifically about the kind of relationship between human intimacy and the management of intellectual property for about a decade. Like I wrote a paper that I was just re-examining last week called Transcending Possessiveness in Love and Music. And, making the case that basically the exclusivity in a contract between an artist and a label is kind of like a marriage contract, at least the way that a 19th century marriage went, where, the man is the provider. And so the man is like the record label. And the woman is, the artist that signs to this label and then gets tour funding and stuff. And, when you start to cut it down that line, then you start to see all of these ways that we have imported our age of cattle husbandry, like a statue of a bull made out of stone at the gates of your temple kind of thinking into not only the way that we manage digital media, which seems like totally ludicrous, but also the way that we manage our expectations of one another in relationship, which is in some ways even more ludicrous. So
definitely. Well, both the things are hangovers from the same event, right? As you were talking about cattle husbandry, right? This all began at the birth of civilization about 12,000 years ago. So this is like Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs and Steel talks about like the whole of society sprung up because of our move from hunter-gatherer lifestyle to agrarian, sessile people who are farmers. So when we moved from hunter-gatherers were traditionally egalitarian, and their relationship styles reflected that. Like relationships were about 2 years, which is about the time it takes for a baby to be conceived, born, and start walking. And at that point, they didn't need ownership. They didn't need the marriage unit anymore, right? So they went back and had sex with other people and had babies with different people of the same tribe and spread the diversity and things like this. So this big transition didn't actually happen until we started farming, because when we started farming, we wanted to stay in the same place. We grew more than we could eat. And this is a huge thing, because when we grow more than we can eat, you start getting bureaucracy. When you start getting bureaucracy, you start getting tracking of how much food you have and who's got what. All of a sudden, every single person doesn't have to be a hunter-gatherer. So you've moved in this position where some people can be bureaucrats. And the first person is the chief. So the chief doesn't farm. The chief manages the tribe. Then you get soldiers to defend the food, and then you get infinite levels of bureaucracy as we move from hunter-gatherers into nation states. And when you first start farming, you have the concept of property. When you can only own what you can carry, the concept of property is pretty much meaningless, right? And when you move into a sessile agrarian society, you start having babies quicker, you start owning things because you have a house, and these ideas carry through. Like marriage, pretty much as far as I know, didn't exist before we moved into farming. Then after that, you get, we're seeing Napster is the progression of farming. Like that's it. Much as the way is marriage and everything else, and it's all about assets, property, and those were concepts that didn't exist before farming. So it's all the same thing. We're just rehashing the same fucking evolutionary baggage over and over again, but now we've been liberated, man. We have internet. Internet changed fucking everything. Well, computers before that. Computers, internet, and then we're seeing all these emergences now, and this is the birth of the singularity. Like before these things, singularity couldn't happen. Now it can, and it's by moving away from these systems, the traditional systems, into the new systems.
I almost wonder if we're looking at this wrong, because I think about singularities, right? Verbal language, like syntax, was a singularity. There's no way for you to imagine an oral storytelling culture as an orangutan, good luck. Then written language is a singularity, right? The Library of Alexandria is like inside the black hole at the end of Interstellar to somebody who's just been spending their whole lives, completely illiterate. And now we're seeing, I almost think I'm polyamorous when it comes to singularities, if you will, because I'm looking at it now and it's like blockchain looks like a singularity to me. The internet in a general stroke, you can sort of argue is like a slow motion singularity. It's actually happening a lot faster than oral language emerging, over that flash point invisible to the fossil record. It's like, this is like the fossil history of humankind went from like nothing to like Wall-E, like the entire surface of the world covered in like used car parts and stuff.
Definitely.
Like instantly. So
there is another fossil record that exists though in this. So there's the fossil record we carry around with us inside our bodies. Obviously, like I'm a geneticist, right? So around, I think it was about 100,000 years ago, may have been more, was the evolution of Homo. So we're Homo sapiens. Now, that was a fucking big one. So I did, for my final essay in genetics, I looked at the genetic differences between humans and chimps. Okay. Like humans, and basically there was a big split. We have humans, we have chimps, we have gorillas.
Bonobos.
Yeah, and then in the hominid line, there was this event that happened, and it's remarkable. There was 17 separate gene changes that all happened in one generation. Now, this blows my mind, right? And they were they're called the human accelerated regions, HARs. And they're all long non-coding RNAs. So they, just to give a bit of background. So if you look at the genome of a mouse and you look at the genome of a human, they're pretty much the same with respect to genes. The difference is in the amount of junk DNA. And it's not junk. We know it regulates the expression of the genes. So we know about 80% of this junk is being expressed, and that means it has an effect. So a huge part of these were responsible for brain development. And basically what happened was it's called a selective sweep. These changes happened, and anyone that didn't have this change was wiped out. And that was the birth of Homo as we think about it. Now, we know this record exists because we can check our DNA and the DNA of other chimps. And we also, one more thing is we know how genes change. So some mutations are more likely to happen than others. So we can look for unusual patterns, and we can also look for the things that would have changed naturally across time between us and our ancestors. So this is a really good way for us to investigate things that couldn't have been fossilized. That record, as we're looking at it, we have to look in another rubbish dump, and the rubbish dump is actually like an archive of information, which is what our DNA is. And it's been saved somewhere. In fact, it's been kept inside us, man. We can interpret it now. We can go back and fucking sequence ourselves and see how these things have changed, which is fucking mind-blowing.
That is mind-blowing. I mean, I'm just wondering about that in light of all of these recent fossil discoveries, like within the last few months, that put human beings much older. Like I think that we did recent fossil evidence. It would be older than you said, because there's recent fossil evidence from Morocco that the genus Homo goes back like 300,000 years. And then we found some early humans in Europe, like way earlier than we thought, and and like way earlier in North America than we thought was going on. But at any rate,
another one way older, which was Homo florensis. Was found to be like fucking around for ages, we're talking like 10 to 15,000 years ago or some shit, like was alive really, really recently. Don't quote me on the fucking numbers, but way later than we thought, like maybe he's been living there for a lot longer and has been extinct, maybe was living around the same time as woolly mammoths, who knows?
Oh, and that's, that whole thing, that the mammoths were around after the pyramids, still for like 1,000 years after the pyramids.
One thing we forget is that the pyramids are really fucking old. Like really old, man. They're like 4,000 BC or some shit. You know what I mean? Like Cleopatra lived closer to us than she did the building of the pyramids.
Oh yeah, you want to play that game? Okay, so
we're gonna
yeah. So everyone thinks about like dinosaurs, right? Mm-hmm. But the age of dinosaurs was 160 million years, which means the end of T-Rex is closer to us than T-Rex was to the first dinosaurs, or even to Stegosaurus, like in the middle of the age of dinosaurs. And I was thinking about that, and then I was like, okay, all right. So from the Cambrian explosion which was the moment where we get all the modern phyla, like the evolution of the eye. And then suddenly everything explodes because the eye is a big deal and it creates all these new layers in the ecosystem. That's 540 million years ago. And sharks are 450 million years ago. And then we don't even really like climb out on land until like, you know, for like another 150 million years after that.
Yeah.
It's like you can put the entire age of dinosaurs in between sharks and the first reptiles. Like, and like the difference, like the gap between the first eye and the first like legit fish is bigger. I mean, it's just like we don't, you know, you look at this time, it's just insane to me.
Dude, like I study microbes a lot, right?
Okay, yeah.
We're talking like, man, they've been around for 3.8 to 4.1 billion years. Like literally, this is the really interesting thing, the Fermi paradox, right? If life is so common and so there's this like drive to create life, where the fuck is it? Because pretty much as soon as life could have formed on Earth, it did. Like without a doubt, right? We have like evidence of fossils going back 3.8. On land, we have evidence of microbes on land 3.5 billion, maybe a little bit more. This is so fucking long ago. Like Earth was fucked, you know. We're talking late heavy bombardment period. There's like asteroids coming down and shit all the time. And what's crazier is that there is one ancestor to everything, right? You got last universal common ancestor, that one microbe gave birth to all life. But it hasn't happened again on Earth that we can find, which is expected if everything's outcompeting this newer form of life. But also at the same time, like the only thing that survived was from one place, from what we know now, which is fucking crazy. But you know, microbes inhabited the Earth for a really long time. Like up until 2.2 billion years, the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. So the great oxygenation event happened then, and then that transformed everything and paved the way for life later on. But like, fuck, man, you know, it's not until I studied microbiology and I was 2 years in before I really grasped the power of microbes. These little fucking factories that just cycle nutrients. And my entire, like most of my life trying to share molecular biology with people is getting people to understand the power of microbes. These little fucking factories that just cycle things continuously. Anyway, we are way fucking topic, by the way.
No. This is great. I think we are exactly where we need to be because check this out.
Yeah.
I met you when I was on tour in Australia on the good graces of my friend Bruce Damer, who actually, he's really interested in the origins of life research. He's going to be on the cover of Scientific American in August with Dave Deemer, his co-author, about research that they were doing in Australia.
I think I know Bruce. Was he doing some work out at the Pilbara location?
Yes.
And he was doing his virtual worlds, man. Yeah, I met him, man. Was he involved with fucking Doom or something?
Yeah. He's got a long and storied history with computing. He's got the DigiBarn, the Computer History Museum, and like he took me and my friends through there back in April when we were out for the MAPS conference, and it's fascinating to meet somebody. You know, it's an interesting phenomenon that it seems that people who are interested in microbiology and people who are interested in computers are often the same people. You know, and I think that kind of speaks to the future of computing, but I'll leave that there for now. I want to say though that like the interesting thing, like we launched off on this tangent in the polysingularity deal.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great moment to wrap it back, because what aren't we recapitulating with this singularity, if not the singularity, which is life, right? Life itself. And then life itself, according to the recent and best evidence, is something that for the first however long, it wasn't even one cell, actually. Like they're finding that it was the last universal common ancestor they're calling the progenote, which was this sort of biofilm made out of loosely associated. I mean, it was like individuality didn't really exist for the first couple 100 million years. And it's like the origins of life are actually in a group. It's in a network of genetic plenum, like just, identity fluid sort of doing its thing. And so it really resembles in a lot of ways the human story more specifically, like the way that we started, like you were saying, we started in these sort of very fluid and unrestricted tribal affiliations before we started to fence it up. And so it's in a weird way, it's like, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that decentralized web applications and polyamory are actually like an atavistic biomimicry adaptation. Like if we're looking at the origins of life, and it's like, oh well, the origins of life was a worker-owned cooperative, run by everyone. They were all sleeping with each other.
So in genetics, we have this thing called the central dogma of genetics, and it's beautiful, right? It says, and like really, if the take-home message from today, if you fucking want to learn anything about genetics, the central dogma is where it's at. So DNA gets turned into RNA, and RNA gets turned into proteins. Now, I was always like, DNA and proteins, that's where it's at. The proteins are catalytic. They are the ones that catalyze reactions. They're the ones that cycle nutrients. And DNA is the library. It's the one that contains all the information. What do you need RNA for? We've actually found out that in the beginning, it was probably RNA. In fact, we're pretty confident of this. And the reason for this is that RNA can be both the library and the catalyst. So it can fulfill both the functions. The things that turn RNA into protein is RNA. It's a ribonucleoprotein, but basically it's a catalytic piece of RNA that translates the genetic code into a functional organism, a functional protein, or a structural protein, but basically it translates. So in the beginning, we think it was a big soup of RNA. It was just this giant fucking clusterfuck gangbang orgy of RNA. Now, there's a lot of like different opinions as to how things kind of went about. We think it went RNA, then proteins, because RNA can form the translation protein, so it can turn the RNA into protein, and then we can have it go back and then turn the RNA back into DNA. In short, though, we think it was a big soup of RNA beforehand. Now, when you were talking about compartmentalization, was it life back then? When it was RNA, when it was just a giant RNA soup, was it life? And that's your question. You can answer that one. I'm down to say yes. I mean, you're talking about reproduction. You're talking about inheritance. You're talking about adaptation. Yeah. So why not? Compartmentalization. So without compartmentalization, we don't classify things as life at the moment, right? So we don't have a classification for life. So NASA, I think we might have even had this conversation. NASA used to say any self-replicating organism capable of Darwinian selection is life. And that was that when we went on Viking to Mars, the Viking lander, that was our classification. And then all of a sudden people brought up, mainly probably science fiction writers, brought up all these cases. What about if you have an immortal organism? A transcendental being, God, right? If you're God, it wouldn't classify as life because it doesn't evolve necessarily. It's not capable of Darwinian replication as God. The way we think about it, it would have to make another organism, right?
Well, I mean, I guess that depends on how you would delimit that organism within a quantum phase space, for example. Because just because something doesn't die in the fourth dimension doesn't mean that it's not limited among the available possible realities in quantum end space. And I think, that's where you get into this whole issue. Like we're getting into the possible science of some esoteric shit here. I think that it's entirely possible that we do have this sort of, Rainer Maria Rilke's angels that serenely disdain to annihilate us, that these are like a valid electromagnetic phenomenon that, due to their essential nature as superfluid and thus non-local entities, that they're nonetheless constrained by certain laws that sort of fit the mythological portrait of gods as immortal but limited in important ways, and therefore characters, but again, it's like, there's like this whole sort of gray area, life and non-life. These categories aren't really useful anymore, maybe.
Yeah, definitely, because we're going down, as you said, we're going to this like quantum surreal existential crisis, right? But when we're talking about looking for life, that's the fucking realm we exist in, right? Do angels fuck? Do angels breed? Like, if they don't, they're not capable of self-replicating Darwinian selection. So like, we are in that space. And as an astrobiologist, we are in that space. Like, where do we set the fucking boundaries, right? We don't know. We have a sample size of 1. Mm-hmm. So we have to look at what life is on Earth and then extrapolate from that and then set barriers where they're meaningful. So like, are crystals alive? Is fire alive? These are 2 big questions that I wrangle with, because those are things which guide me to say, okay, well, what is life and how is that different to an RNA world and a post-RNA compartmentalized cellular world? Because that's definitely life. Before it, there's big question marks everywhere. We're not going to say it definitely has qualities we would attribute with life. Now, NASA's official definition has changed. Their official definition, from what I've understood, is what is life? We'll know it when we find it.
There was a justice in the U.S. that ruled that famously for pornography, that says, I'll know it when I see it. That was like back in the 90s. I know it when I see it. So it's which is
interesting though. Yeah. It makes it very subjective, right? Because the thing is, we can say that things have lifelike qualities without being life, right? So fire has an energetic gradient. It self-replicates. It can't adapt, but it displays a lot of qualities we think of with life. And crystals, they have this like program they follow, right? And they self-replicate and they adapt according to their situations to make different types of crystals. So they kind of evolve according to their things. But like, inherently, we know that fire and crystals aren't alive the same way an animal is. But that same understanding
way. I think that's kind of critical. Like, I think, you know, maybe what we're looking at is in the same way that you start with RNA, but then the system gets complex enough that it requires that RNA fork off and create extra layers of proteins and DNA. And RNA just becomes, we're seeing something like that going on again, to like weave this back in. We're see that going on with national currencies aren't going away. They're just relying on, like within 5 or 10 years, all these big countries are going to be using the Ethereum protocols as the back end for their national currencies.
That's right.
In a similar way, I would say that the future doesn't seem to just completely pave over stuff so much as it just weaves it into a bigger, more complex structure. And so we're not getting rid of, in this sort of deconstructionist sense, the notions of life and non-life. We're just embedding them in a far more complex and mysterious set of possibilities. That it's like we have all of these sort of hybrid categories and like intermediate categories. I think crystals deserve some amount of lifeness.
Oh, dude, I agree wholeheartedly. And this is why fire and crystals are hard to deal with, right? Is because they display so many qualities that are lifelike. And this is amazing. It's looking like if you've ever held a perfect crystal, and you realize that every single atom in that entire thing is perfectly arranged, it's a magic experience. Every crystal and mineral you hold has some degree of this, and perfect crystals have a high degree of this, and that's what makes them more amazing. This is why I really enjoy synthetically created gemstones, is because I don't call them synthetic, I call them perfect, right? And I don't think just because they were made by humans, they're any less magical or important than if they're formed by natural processes or natural in the way that geological processes create them.
In a way, they're even more magical, because if where else in the universe can we look and find zirconium that was made by a machine? That's pretty rare and bizarre and awesome.
I actually agree. I prefer synthetic gemstones over natural ones. But also on this same token, where the fuck was I going with that? Where were we going?
Oh,
Hold on.
that life and non-life.
Life and non-life. Oh, yeah. So when we're talking about this, these like infinite permutations and the way that things change, like you've got currencies adapting, you've got governments. And I think as well, the big thing is companies are like governments, right? So we've got banks that are backing cryptocurrencies before you have governments signing on. And this basically makes banks as powerful as governments. Like they'll guide where it goes. Everyone has these different things. Like, people change their mind in a day. A religion takes 1,000 years to change its mind over things. But like you have different things leading the way at different parts in the hierarchy. Now, on this as well, what we're doing is not actually like anything special. We're just creating new ecosystems for these things to evolve into. So money's had an ecosystem for a long time. We create crypto networks, and all of a sudden you have a new ecosystem for that money to funnel through and evolve. And the thing is, it's always going to preference the thing that evolves faster. People criticize cryptocurrencies because they're volatile. The reason that they're volatile is because they're evolving quicker. And that means cryptocurrencies will be the future of currency. So we see the reason banks see this as exciting is because there's a lot more risk taking, there's a lot more chance, there's a lot more luck, and all these things are permutating to create more perfect systems. So they're just opening up the ecosystem. The internet is another ecosystem. So when we're talking about singularities, they are singularities in a sense that they're opening up new ecosystems to evolve into. So like when life moved to land, that was a singularity where there was a new ecosystem that opened up. Up until then, it was the only thing. The Great Oxygenation Event was an ecosystem that changed the whole ecosystem that everything evolved into, except the things that were at the bottom of the ocean that can stay ancient forever. And that's where the fucking governments are going, and that's where the banks are going, and that's where people who fucking sign contracts that say you can't fucking release your music on any other label are going.
Dude, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that because, exploring this archetypally. So I talk about the Great Oxygenation Event a lot, actually, because it is. I may have actually talked about it when you heard me speak at Earth Frequency, because I was looking at like punctuation marks in life history. Yeah. And that one in particular, I think we're sort of reproducing it now in some important respects. Like photosynthesis pollutes the atmosphere with oxygen, which is poisonous at the time to everything. And so we get a split. We get the bifurcation of the anaerobic microbes that, like you're saying, decide that they're going to stay underground and at the bottom of the sea. And then you get the organisms that adapt to the polluted atmosphere and end up forming the glycolytic metabolism, which is like all animals and fungi. So, yeah. And then you have a new loop formed between the photosynthesis and glycolysis. And these two metabolisms end up sort of stabilizing the atmosphere of the Earth and creating this whole new context for things. We're seeing something like that going on now with, I think, like in general, I'll just say plastics, but let's say like industrial waste and byproducts of industrial manufacture. And then there's like, we're right at that crisis point where it's becoming economically valid and interesting to talk about setting up like an AI harvester drone that just scrapes trash out of the sea. And instead of mining for it, that we've mined all this stuff already and it's sitting in a landfill or it's sitting in the ocean. And so the reclamation of this, which was technically impossible until we got to the point where we could actually sort it. But like, again, to talk, Bruce Damer, when he was on Duncan Trussell, the Family Hour podcast, he was talking about how we won't go to asteroids to mine asteroids for rare earth minerals because we have so many of them sitting in landfills already. And, it's so much more cost effective to just send a robot into a landfill to mine all of your e-waste out of that, and pick up all the, the like palladium and stuff out of used catalytic converters than it is to like send that robot into space to mine it.
There's two things going on there. Yeah. So when we go to space and we mine asteroids, it's not to bring it back to Earth. We're mining asteroids to set up space factories, right? And that's where the real value in it will be. It's that you send a rocket off Earth, but you never bring it back down, so you escape the gravity well. So that's my my.
You mean you never cash out your Bitcoin into dollars? It's just Bitcoin now.
Amen. It's the long-term things, the long-term investments. Now, also back on Earth, you're right. We will mine rubbish dumps, and we will mine the plastic dump in the ocean. But the way we'll mine it, I think, will be about like getting onto 2030. That's gonna be a big fucking. We're talking about milestones and punctuation, right? As we accelerate, the punctuation becomes quicker and quicker. It's like by 2030, every single fucking letter will be punctuated in a sentence, right? There's just so much change happening so quickly because we're the rate at which we're advancing is advancing. So we're like accelerating, not just linearly progressing towards something. Now, when we do this, once we get replicators, we'll probably also have before replicators, we'll have molecular deconstructors that will sort these atoms into the things they want. The benefit of rubbish dumps and plastic chips and stuff is that the materials and the atoms are highly sorted. So if we put a reasonably pure bit of palladium in, we'll get a reasonable bit of a collection of palladium ions or atoms come out the other end. And that's where the benefit comes. But once we get these molecular deconstructors, you'll just feed rubbish dumps into them and they'll just pull out in a collection of the periodic table. And this work's going on pretty heavily now. In fact, if any of your listeners want to make a lot of money, get into molecular sorting, it's mark my words, in 20 years' time, you'll thank me. So on Earth, we're going to be molecularly sorting heaps. But the big problem is that all the heavy elements on Earth, the vast majority, have sunk to the core. So this is why, even though we have a shit ton of some stuff, it's all in context. What are we building? Are we building are we turning all the Earth material that we have access to into computers? Because if it does, we're going to need asteroids, or we're going to need some fucking hectic technology that can program using silicon and nickel and iron, these lighter elements that are at the top. All the heavy Earth ones, when the Earth was a molten ball of steel, they're heavier, so they sunk to the center. And that's where all of the uranium and all that cool shit is. So I think it's as we fuck, man, uranium is the best. We're just gonna be talking. We got lots of thorium around, man, but I'm a big fan of fission. That's where it's at.
Well, oh man, as a resident of the North American continent, I have to disagree with you because I'm sitting on this insane powder keg where we have two enormous super volcanoes, the Yellowstone, and then I forget what's right next to the Yellowstone, but there's another one that's comparably, maybe even bigger. And then we have, I don't even know how many hundreds of nuclear reactors all over the continent that are just ready to geyser nuclear waste as soon as those volcanoes go off. Whole Earth, this. I ran into this right before I was on the road to the MAPS conference, and I stopped in Albuquerque, and this little old lady in the grocery store in Albuquerque stopped me. I don't know, am I wearing a sign or something that says, I need you to grab me by the lapels and tell me how we need to deactivate all of the nuclear reactors in North America before Yellowstone explodes? Because it veered into the kook a little bit, because she was saying, the real reason that we're not going to Mars is that it's too radioactive, and that she thought that, if you look at, the hemisphere of Mars that's excavated and glassed, and that some people think is due to an enormous lightning storm, she was like, all that shit's radioactive. That's evidence of a nuclear war, which I draw the line. I'm not going there, but I did find what she had to say about, basically we're going to ruin the entire Northern Hemisphere if we don't get ourselves out of nuclear energy. And it's well, how do I argue with that? Except to say, don't worry, the Yellowstone's not going to blow in the next 1,000 years. It's I don't know.
I can tell you how to argue with that straight up.
Okay.
Fuck, global warming will kill us in 100 years, man. And how much carbon dioxide do nuclear... Do we want to go down this path? Because, like, man, I can argue for literally hours. I'll warn you now. I had an argument with my dad.
Okay.
That last, I'm not kidding, 4 days. So wake up, start arguing. He got high, smoking heaps of weed. I got heaps drunk. We continued arguing until we passed out. We woke up. 4 days, man. 4 days.
I wish that my dad had the stamina for that. He's a non-conflict kind of a guy. I only get to argue with him when we're stuck in the car together, which is rarely because he flies.
My dad and I have this download where we just sit down and we both just speak at the same times and absorb everything the other one has done since we last saw each other. So we need like maximum 3 months between visits just so that we can download. Now, my dad grew up during the Cold War, right? So he's like fucking scared of nukes, man. But like, I didn't. And I was always like, I like to take the other opinion, but not without being educated. So I'm like, you know what? If something's demonized enough, maybe I should listen to their side of the story because maybe there's more to it than that, right?
Okay.
And like, you know, Hitler's the obvious one, right? You're like, well, no one can be that evil. Well, it turns out with Hitler, he actually was that evil. But like, you know.
But he had a micro penis and, you know, like, I can understand being that angry.
Yeah,
you know?
And you know what? Like, he got kicked out of art school. Like, fuck that. You know what happens when you get kicked out of art school? You fucking take over Europe. Well, some people do. He's got ambition at least, right? So, but the thing is that, you know, he was a vegetarian. He launched the world's first anti-smoking campaign, but he was still a pretty evil dude. But, you know, everything he thought he was doing was right. And I thought that was the lesson I took away from that, even though he was definitely an evil dude, right?
Well, that's the thing about the Nuremberg trials is that's where we encounter the banality of evil. It's like all of us make these awkward decisions that we have to make. We have to validate the decision on the basis of I've got to be doing the right thing. Like wherever your scope, wherever your ability to like hold open that vulnerable heart of you is, and that's like where that stops. Where you're like, I'm taking care of my family. Yeah, but you're fucking up this ecosystem, farmer guy. Yeah. You know. Yeah. Like, okay, you know, it's easy to sympathize.
It's interesting as well because if you speak to just take 100 people, over half of them will tell you we need some form of population control. Hitler.
So just kill those people. I'm sorry.
Kill those people. So like the thing is that like, you know, the ideas that he's putting forward aren't that different than what the majority of the population believe. It's how he did it and what his fucking criteria were for being the people that survive and the people that die, or the people that don't breed. You know, a lot of the Jewish people were sterilized, not executed, which is like both those things are terrifying. But
and
like,
honestly, how different is that from them finding out with internal corporate research that cell phones give you cancer and then still encouraging you to put it in your pocket? Like I know a guy who had his testicles removed because he got testicular cancer from always keeping his cell phone in his pocket. And he's like, we started this with the Bitcoin conversation being like, if only I had he's like, if only I had just switched pockets every once in a while.
That's it. Save your sperm, people. But, you know, a lot of these barriers get removed with genetics. You know, we can take certain cells from your body and we can clone that at the very least. But, you know, we're doing things now where we have like, you know, babies born with 3 parents genetically. Yeah. Where we take the mitochondria out. So there's like, what I think about a lot is like IVF, right? Like I'm from a genetics perspective against IVF. Why? Because we're allowing people that shouldn't breed to be able to breed. But from a life extension perspective, I'm not against IVF because if people have waited until they're too old to have babies and then they have babies, then all of a sudden we get people that live longer because we're selecting for older parents, which means we know this in fruit fly experiments that extends life. So I've got like, with all these things, I have all these conflicting views. Back to nuclear power, though, man. Yeah. If you shut down a nuclear power plant, what do you replace it with?
Solar.
No.
Why not?
Because fucking shit.
Are you kidding me? I mean, solar's on the same curve. It's getting better every year. It's getting cheaper. You know, I'm really impressed with the Tesla roofing tiles, the solar roofing. I mean, let me paint my electric RV, my amphibious electric RV in solar panels, please.
Yeah.
Solar paint. So what?
Problem is, it comes down to how much power do you get?
Yeah.
With solar, nothing, baby. Nothing.
Then again, if plants, photosynthesis is like what, 10% efficient, something like that. And so, that took over the surface of the planet. Like, there's no reason why you're looking at it being a bottom-up approach to energy production. Yeah. Paint everything. Your clothes have solar fibers in them. So that's done. And then so your shirt is charging your phone.
Yeah.
Solved.
What I'm saying is that you can paint everything, but by the time we paint everything, it's too late. So at the moment, I see it as a battle against global warming. And in the battle against global warming, we need big power sources to displace coal. And solar won't do it.
But at the same time, I'm not opposed to nukes reactors as in the same way that I think I told you about how I was at this festival and this woman just categorically rejected genetically modified organisms. Said, give me one example where it's helped. I was like, no, look, there's this, and this. Didn't want to hear it. You know me well enough to know that I'm not categorically rejecting any technology, even the most gruesome weapon can be used for art under the right circumstances.
Technologies are double use technologies, right? They can be used for good or they can be used for evil. An axe can be used for evil.
The reactors that we have now are almost entirely in areas that are seismologically at risk. We're looking at swapping out one short-term thinking mistake for another. That's basically where I see this.
It's about how we deal with imminent threat, right? So building nuclear reactors in the short term may curb global warming, and we can use the power generated from those to make more sustainable forms of power. The thing is, nuclear power produces so much energy. It's unfathomable to think how much power it generates from so little matter with so little waste. And nuclear meltdowns, we can talk about them quickly. So it's not a failure of the nuclear power that was built in a seismologically active area. That's a problem with the design, not the technology itself. So building a nuclear reactor in Japan is not a great idea because you're sitting on the circle of fire or whatever they fucking call it. You're sitting on fucking transverse fault. Australia, well, obviously I'm fucking biased, man. I'm from Australia for anyone that wants to.
You guys are rich in uranium. It's true.
Hugely rich in uranium, tectonically stable. Do you know why fucking Bruce Damer and Tara study in Australia?
Because Australia has money due to its uranium deposits?
No, it doesn't. That all goes to private organizations.
Oh, I give up.
Because we have rocks. We have some of the oldest rocks in the world because we're tectonically stable. We haven't moved, man, basically since Earth has been here. We have stayed in this fucking same spot. We haven't been subducted. We haven't done all this shit. We've just sat here, right? We've got trees that were around since Gondwana land that are still fucking there exactly as they were. I had the joy of going to Lamington National Park, which is on the east coast of Australia, about 2/3 of the way up. And I saw trees as they were when the dinosaurs were there, man. Like the same fucking forest, right? So if we're going to pick a fucking stable area of the world to build radioactive power plants, we'd do it in Australia. Now, this is why I'm down for nuclear power in Australia. We have tons of uranium. We're tectonically stable. It makes sense here. It doesn't make sense everywhere, if you're in Iceland, man, use geothermal power. That makes heaps of sense. But until fusion comes along, proper tokamak reactors being rolled out all around the world, we need to displace coal. And solar can't fucking cut it. Solar is a very, very important technology. The problem is, I've been to the biggest solar power plants in Australia. They were 3 football fields wide, right? The size of 3 football fields, and they powered 4,500 homes. And that's in a city that has 400,000 people. the amount of energy you expend to build the solar panels, to mine the materials, if you spent the same amount building a nuclear reactor, in the next 200 years, by building a nuclear reactor, you actually curb the amount of carbon that's produced, because nuclear reactors produce no carbon, except in the mining and the building of them. So 15% of the world's power right now in Germany, America mainly, is produced by nuclear power. And all those countries like Portugal and shit that fucking claim, oh, hey, you know, we have fucking 100% renewable energy. They did this because they did it in spring. And then when they need the power during winter, they can rely upon Germany's nuclear reactors. So it's still...
Busted.
Yeah, man. Fuck, like, you know, these countries rely upon the grid. And we'll talk about the grid just briefly, right?
Yeah.
The grid has to be stable. So electricity moves in waves, right? It's you know, Tesla was saying if you want the answers to the universe, you look for frequency, modulation, and wavelength, or something along these lines. He's saying look to waves. Right? Our whole power generation basically happens on the back of waves. So say, for example, you've got USA, and I bring a reactor on. It doesn't matter. Let's say it's a nuclear reactor. Basically, it sends out power in waves, and the waves have to match what's on the grid. Now, either the reactor is powerful enough that it matches the grid, or the grid pulls the nuclear reactor into phase. Like literally the magnets that are spinning align with the grid. When you think about energy on this scale, it just fucking blows your mind, man, to think about how much power is on that, racing through those wires, through those substations.
Right. Okay, but let's talk about the grid again, because in the U.S. we got 3 of them. There's East Coast, West Coast, and Texas. So like, talk about existential risk. Even if Kim Jong-un talks about nuking Austin, I would still say Texas is a relatively good bet, especially we have no income tax here. So, okay. At any rate, the thing about the grid, and this is sort of one of the first major issues that I felt like I had to, you know, go Chicken Little and run around and tell everybody, is that the grid that we have is a legacy grid. And again, this is one of these issues where it's like, we're not implementing any of these technologies in ideal situations, right? The legacy grid, by which I mean all 3 of these, as well as the grids in Europe and Asia, they're all by and large decades old. They're not built with an understanding of the dynamism of our magnetic environment, either on Earth or the magnetic activity of the sun, which, you know, because we only launched the Solar Dynamic Observatory a few years ago, we really only recently began to understand that there's a magnetic umbilical cord between the Earth and the sun, and that the Earth is subject to all of these largely unpredictable fluctuations. Yeah. And so there was a good reason for people to be concerned that Solar Cycle 24 in 2012, that, you know, all of these, like, you know, reputable folks were walking around beating on the doors saying, we need to install as many gaps and grounds and surge protectors in this system as we possibly can, because it wasn't built to handle a surge of the kind that we saw in 1859 with the solar flare that caused the Carrington event and knocked out all the telegraph wires everywhere. And, you know, people were reading their newspapers by aurora light in Florida. And it's just like, our situation is so delicate right now. And I guess this is sort of like, this is the thing that we can zoom out a little bit and agree on this, and agree on looping it back to the stability of, or rather the anti-fragility of a decentralized network. The reason that solar is so appealing is because it doesn't have a single point of failure like a nuclear reactor does, where if you have a solar flare that knocks out our electrical grid for 3 days, you've like destroyed civilization.
Definitely. So the big problem here is that the grid isn't set up to receive solar, as you've said, right? So basically, if you add the grid is a centralized grid. In America, in Australia, all the way across the world, we have centralized grids. So the problem is you need to upgrade the grid if you want to add mass solar onto it. So that's why I'm saying in the short term, it's better to get rid of coal, replace it with nuclear, update the grid to be a smart grid, then put all your renewables on. Like this is the better way of doing it, because right now Australia is limiting people putting solar onto the grid because it's destabilizing the grid, because you have all these different phases of electricity competing with each other, and it destabilizes the grid, and then you get blackouts, patchy blackouts all across the place. You have the possibility of destroying the entire grid. So you can replace coal, and you can sell it to the coal. Like, I'm pragmatic, right? I'm like, okay, you can sell it to the mining industries that you can replace coal with solar. Then we've knocked out carbon dioxide as a problem. Then we can think of the next thing. Capitalism lends itself to models that are in crisis continuously.
Right.
So you can drive global warming down and us towards a more sustainable future by having nuclear as a stopgap in the middle. And I agree, it's a fucking Band-Aid, right? It is a Band-Aid, but it's the Band-Aid which causes us not to all die. And that's the argument that basically sold me on nuclear, which is that it's the only thing powerful enough to replace baseline energy on the grid if you remove coal. And the big problem is baseline power. So it's basically what keeps the grid in phase. Until you get smart grids, you need baseline power. People will say it's a lie. People that say that are wrong. Basically, you need smart grids to be able to have solar on the grid.
So this is actually comparable in some respects. I'm trying to like find the Hail Mary pass to weaving this all into one unified thread. This is comparable to the question of how do we transcend the current financial system with blockchain, you know, or like how do we move out of like an ownership model in art, life, and relationship to a license and permission access-based model. Cliffhanger! Tune in next week for the rest of this conversation where we discuss the blackest black and the pinkest pink in the world and the role of the artist in an era beyond intellectual property. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod Network. Be sure to go to mindpodnetwork.com and check it out. And if you'd like to support this show, patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Thanks again.